Have you ever begun playing a game without any idea how to actually play it, and as a result of your lack of proper instruction, you've taken too long to become reasonably decent at it? Maybe you're at a store that has a demo station set up. Maybe you go to a friend's house while they're having a party and you jump into a multiplayer game with some people, but no one wants to take the time to explain the intricacies of a game's controls and systems to you. Or maybe you get yourself a game that you've been looking forward to for a long time, but the developers didn't build enough subtle guidance into the game to actually explain their drastic new gameplay system to you. My name is Calvin, and this is Ludus Lounge. Over Christmas, I received Supergiant Games' most recent title, Transistor, as a gift during the winter Steam sale, and I was very happy because it was something that I had been hotly anticipating ever since I played their first game, Bastion. Bastion was a revelation of a game. It made me weak in the knees with how good it was, and after I had finished, I was instantly in love with Supergiant Games, and I was practically foaming at the mouth waiting for them to follow it up. And if I knew Supergiant the way I thought I did, then I knew that there were going to be parts in Transistor combining music and narration and gameplay into these perfect, emotionally affecting moments that would have had much more gravitas if I discovered them for myself. And as a result, I avoided looking up walkthroughs or gameplay videos, or even reviews until I could get my hands on it. But when I actually played it, I found myself perplexed and confused at the radical new combat system Supergiant had introduced, and for the first hour or so of the game, I wasn't doing too well at it. I proposed that there is one simple solution the developers could have implemented which would have saved me all of that frustration and made the new mechanics intuitive and easier to learn. Now, before you get all snarky in the comments and tell me that I suck at playing games, first of all, you're right. And I've come to grips with that. But we're taking an in-depth look at game design in this series, so let me explain. In Bastion, every time you get a weapon, you're given the chance to learn how to use it in a relatively safe situation. That way you aren't risking anything to experiment with its functionality, and you learn how to use the buttons on the controller. For example, when you first get the hammer, it's automatically assigned to the B button, so you're trained to think B equals hammer. Then when you get the repeater, it's assigned to the X button, training you to make that connection. But then you get the bow, and the game equips it in place of the repeater for you, which undermines your prior expectations, and now you realize that you have multiple options. And when you finally get to the armory, the idea that you can experiment with your combinations is driven home when you're given the option to assign any weapon to any button. With Bastion, Supergiant gave us new systems that had never been seen before, but they used gameplay and brilliantly subtle narration to gradually explain them to us throughout the game. The developers struck a perfect balance between holding your hand with an overly detailed tutorial and throwing you into the experience without any explanation whatsoever. That way, whether you were a veteran or if this was your first time playing an isometric action RPG, you were given everything you needed to know to play the game. The main problem with Transistor, in my opinion, is that while Supergiant introduced a drastically new system for combat, it didn't strike that same balance. Every action in combat is performed by executing what the game calls functions. Technically, you only wield one weapon in the game, but that weapon is able to pull off any one of these functions to perform various attacks ranging in speed and strength, but also to improve each attack by supplementing it with its own special abilities. The game automatically equips your first 4 functions for you, effectively training you to equate each action with a particular button input the same way Bastion did. But the first time you enter an access point, Transistor's equivalent of Bastion's armory, and are given the chance to experiment with moving functions around, a dialog box pops up that says, "Choose which function to upgrade." This simple sentence right here is hugely misleading for 2 reasons. First, because it indicates that every function you get after your first 4 is strictly meant to be used as an upgrade or a passive ability and not a primary one. And second, because it makes the player think that those initial 4 functions are your main attacks and cannot be used as upgrades or passive abilities. And this would be fine if the combat system were rigid and straightforward, but the very nature of the game requires the player to experiment with different functions by mixing and matching each function into different slots to see what they do, and by disabling functions in combat if the player loses all their health, rather than killing the character outright and forcing the player to start each battle from the beginning. Training the player to equate each button with a specific action is antithetical to the way the game encourages you to experiment with different functions, and it winds up being confusing for the first bit of the game. This confusion could have easily been solved with a simple change in the interface. Every time you enter an access point, you should have seen this screen. Then chosen a slot in order to see all of your functions. And what that dialog box should have read is choose which function to install. I feel that doing it that way would have made the need to experiment plainly obvious. Don't get me wrong, I thought Transistor was fantastic, and once I got the hang of the function system, I felt that it fit perfectly into the game. And I liked the way the game disrupted my expectations of death in video games by letting me continue on after losing all my health, just with limited abilities. I could go on about what I loved about Transistor, but because I had to devote all of my attention for the first couple hours just to learning the main combat systems from scratch, I wasn't able to get lost in this beautiful, emotional world that Supergiant had obviously put a great deal of care into. The point is that you should find that middle ground where the game informs the player how to play subtly enough that it doesn't disturb the flow of gameplay, but detailed enough that it doesn't become frustrating for them. Video games are in a unique position among all art forms to be able to communicate all kinds of information through interactivity. And as games become increasingly immersive, that sort of communication is going to be vital to the player's ability to appreciate them. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for a new episode of Ludus Lounge every month. If you didn't like it, please let me know why. And as a parting thought, what are some examples of games that you feel have either had their instructions most effectively built in by the developers, or ones where they were lacking a little bit? Thanks for watching, and remember, never stop playing.